Hello again. This is our third session in our Stories of the Old Testament, in which we're looking at the major events and the major figures and the major times of the Bible events, trying to put them into an order that's understandable and enjoyable. In our last two sessions, we talked about Abraham and then his son Isaac and his grandson Jacob. We relocated Jacob back to the Judean highlands in the last session, and then the Bible switches its story to the stories of Joseph, and we're going to pick that up now. We have the events of Joseph in Egypt, and then Jacob is reintroduced into the story when he's brought to Egypt to be with Joseph, and he dies at that point. So the narrative in the Bible jumps around a little bit, and we're picking up the story at this point of Joseph when he was perhaps 15 or 16. Benjamin was born at that time, and his mother died on the road to Bethlehem. They returned back to the home area near Hebron, which is where Jacob was, and he settled into probably a retirement type existence at that point. Joseph had 10 half-brothers. He had a full brother, Benjamin, but that was a baby. And Benjamin was, at the time that Joseph was sold into slavery, Benjamin was probably a toddler and would have remained at the house. But the 10 half-brothers, who were jealous of Joseph at that point because his father had shown him some favor, had given him a special coat, which was a significant gift in those days when many people perhaps only had one cloak. The brothers had traveled up towards the area of Dothan, which is probably 50 miles north of Hebron, driving their flocks through the summer, most likely, trying to find forage for them and allow them to graze. And Jacob suggested that Joseph should travel up to see his brothers and see how they're doing, but basically report back to the father as to whether they're doing their job properly. Joseph had already angered his brothers by suggesting that he'd had a dream that showed he was going to be superior to his brothers. They would be bowed down to him, and they weren't happy with that report as well. So he traveled up to the area of Dothan, and it was there that he was, at one point they were planning to kill him, but they threw him into a dry cistern, which would suggest we were into the dry season. And then they sold him to Midianite slavers who happened to be traveling down the major trade route along the Mediterranean. Let's take a look at how all of that plays out on the map. If you look at the map here of the ancient world, the southeast corner of the Mediterranean, Jacob was located in Hebron, which is an area perhaps 25 or 30 miles south of Jerusalem. It's on the hills overlooking the Great Rift. And to the north of that, up near the edge of the Judean highlands, is the town of Dothan. And it was to Dothan that Joseph traveled, finally tracking down his brothers, and it was from Dothan that he was sold into slavery, presumably taken along the major trade routes along the Mediterranean there, and then taken to the region of Egypt, where he would then be sold. We have good documentation that Egypt was involved in slaving at that particular time. The outline of Egypt is, as you can see here, the large area to the north is the Delta region, very fertile, but it's a floodplain. It has very few trees, native trees, and it has no rock or quarry, so most of the building materials are brought down river from the southern part of Egypt. And the rest of the kingdom of Egypt is a very narrow, snake-like tract of land that can be settled on either side of the river, but with desert off to the east and the west. Now, Joseph was apparently a very intelligent young man. He would have had to learn the language of Egypt. He probably already spoke some of the Akkadian language that was used as a trade language in the area. And through his skills, he rose to the position of estate manager, kind of a major domo of the estate, as it were, and had risen to a position of complete trust to Potiphar, who used him to manage all aspects of the estate. However, he was sent to jail in what may be one of the first recorded instances of a sexual advance, in which Potiphar's wife, who had found Joseph to be a young, handsome, and attractive young fellow, she tried to seduce him on several occasions, and he refused. And on one occasion, she actually reached out, took his cloak, and he spun away and left the room, and she was left with a piece of his clothing in her room, and to avoid perhaps accusations from the staff or whatever, she accused him of rape, and he was thrown into jail. He spent several years there. During that time, he had occasion to interpret a couple of dreams. One of the advisors to Pharaoh, the cupbearer, was released and returned, and 2 years later, when Pharaoh began having his own troubling dreams, this individual recalled that there was somebody in jail who perhaps could interpret these dreams for Pharaoh, and Joseph was brought before the Pharaoh to explain what the dream was and what the dream meant. It suggested that there would be a period of time in which the crops would be full, but then that would be followed by an extended period of drought, 7 years of each. And it was determined that the best way to solve that problem would be to store up a certain percentage of the crops during the time of plenty, and then they would be able to dole those out as necessary during the coming famine. Pharaoh was so pleased with this interpretation that he appointed Joseph as his vizier. Now, a vizier is probably comparable to the prime minister to the king. He was told that he would be second in the kingdom only to Pharaoh, which means he was the highest ranked advisor to the king at that particular time, and the Bible tells us that he was 30 years old. So he had spent nearly 13 years as the estate manager for Potiphar, and combined with his time in prison. There's a description of his appointment as a vizier, and there are some slides that have been found, or some reliefs that have been found on tomb paintings. This is a picture of the investiture of a vizier. His name was Passer. This was a little bit later than the time of Joseph, but it shows that he was given a special robe of expensive cloth. He was given a gold necklace of some sort. Typically these were pectoral type necklaces, big elaborate gold devices. And then he was also given a seal. This is a ring seal of one of the pharaohs, and this would have been similar, some kind of a symbol that could be carried by the vizier as he traveled around the country that showed he was the emissary of the pharaoh. Now we have 7 years of plenty. Foodstuffs were stored up, and then the famine hit, and we're told that it affected the entire ancient world, the ancient Near East, and that would have also affected his brothers and his father. And eventually, 2 years into the famine, Jacob sent his brothers, without Benjamin, sent his brothers to Egypt to try to buy some grain. It was there that they met Joseph. They didn't recognize him, which is not unreasonable. It was 20 years later. They assumed Joseph was dead. This was a very powerful Egyptian figure. He would have been tanned and shaved and surrounded by guards and speaking Egyptian. And of course, they had to bow with their faces to the floor. They couldn't look upon him, and so they wouldn't have been able to recognize him. I think many of us have had the experience of going to a class reunion 20 years later and speaking to someone that we were good friends with and have no idea who they were 20 years later because of the change in their appearance. At any rate, Joseph insisted that Benjamin be brought. He hadn't seen Benjamin since he was a baby, and I think this might be the reason that he was so insistent that he be reunited with Benjamin. He was nearly 40 years old at this time. Benjamin would have been in his mid-20s, and once they were reunited, Joseph had his father and the entire group of their tribe, the father and the sons and the grandsons, brought to the most fertile portion of Egypt, which was the land of Goshen on the northeast corner of the delta. Let's take a look at how that played out. From Beersheba, Jacob and his family would have traveled eventually to Egypt, and they were located in the most desirable portion of that fertile plain, and that's the land of Goshen. The Bible tells us that Israel, meaning Jacob, remember that in the book of Genesis, anytime you see the word Israel, it is referring to the man Jacob. Now, his descendants, his sons, grandsons, and so forth, would eventually be referred to as Israelites. In other words, the descendants of the man Israel. They could have been called Jacobites as well. But he was given the name of Israel, and there are many passages actually where you'll have one long sentence and they'll refer to the man as Israel in one part of the sentence and as Jacob in the other, which can be a little bit confusing. It says, Israel, Jacob, set out with all that was his, and with the 2 sons who had been born to Joseph in Egypt. The members of Jacob's family, which went to Egypt, were 70 in all. Now, this is the entire group of the Israelites. There were 70 males, that's Jacob and Joseph, his 2 sons, and then the 10 brothers and their sons and grandsons. And with the wives and the children, the daughters and the elderly that aren't mentioned in the servants, the tribe of Israelites that went to Egypt at this particular time was probably no more than about 250 or 300 people. Of course, you can calculate how many children they had and work with the numbers, but we're talking about basically a large extended tribe of Bedouin, of Israelites who went to Egypt and were settled in the land of Goshen. Now, if we move on, we are told that Jacob was taken to the Pharaoh. He was introduced. Joseph took him to meet his boss. This would have been a very impressive event for an elderly Bedouin Canaanite or a Semite to be taken to the Pharaoh, who was the most powerful man in that part of the world at that particular time. And it would have been very impressive. And Pharaoh, in his efforts to be friendly perhaps, welcomed him in and then said, "How old are you?" And it's there that we are told that Jacob responded that the years of his travels were 130. He was 130 years old at the time when Joseph was 40. Now that would suggest that he was perhaps in his young 90s or early 90s when he fathered Joseph, and he would have been in his 80s when he fathered his other sons. I know this goes contrary to the romantic notion of a young Jacob and a young Rachel and their love affair, but this is the reality of life in those days. The Bible then goes on to tell us that when Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, this is several years later, he drew up his feet into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. Then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father Israel. The embalming of a man in those days was an Egyptian practice. It was not a Semitic practice. This was not the way that these men were generally treated. They were generally put into the ground and their bodies were allowed to deteriorate, and then the bones would be gathered up and put into a common grave. They would be gathered unto their ancestors. So this is one of those little details that make the Bible believable. We have the story of Jacob being transported to Egypt, and it was there that he was treated according to Egyptian custom because of his son Joseph, who was the vizier. We can see here that it says, Jacob's sons did as he had commanded them, and they carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah. he had asked that he be returned back to his land, to his family land, and he was eventually buried in a tomb where he would be interred with Isaac and with Abraham as well, along with wives. And this is the tomb of the patriarchs that we see in Hebron. Now, the Bible goes on and tells us that Joseph died at age 110. This perhaps is a symbolic number. It may be a real number, but 110 was an indication of a person who had lived an ideal life, blessed by the gods. He lived to be 110, and so Joseph died at that age. He was embalmed, again, the Egyptian practice, and he was eventually returned to Canaan also, but not until the time of the Exodus. When his father died, they made a special trip back to Canaan, returned to Egypt, and then when Joseph died, his body was retained in Egypt until the Exodus left. If we look at the biblical passages here, it says Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's family. Now, Ephraim was one of the sons that was born to him along with Manasseh down in Egypt. And it says after they embalmed him, once again, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. And then later on it points out that Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, and eventually those bones were taken to Shechem in the tract of land that Jacob bought. You may recall that Jacob traveled up to Shechem, and it was there that he bought land. Eventually Dinah was raped. We have the entire episode of the slaughter of the men of Shechem, and then he left, but he still owned that property. That property was yours for all time, in perpetuity in those days. Now, things changed for the Israelites. We would place the Israelites into a period of time known as the Hyksos. It was a time when the Delta region was placed under the control of Semites who had wandered down from the Sinai and from Syria and from Canaan and the Holy Land and took over the Delta region for about 150 years. They were hated and despised by the Egyptians, but they controlled the land in spite of several attempts to throw them out until 1550 about. Those dates again are debated, but roughly around 1550 they threw them out and restored the Delta region to Egyptian rule. And at that time, it's not unreasonable that they would have seen a large population of Israelites, the tribe of Jacob, which had multiplied. You now have a large tribe of Israelites in some of the best land. And not only that, they were of the same background as the hated Hyksos that had just been thrown out. And so it's not unreasonable to think that at that time a new Pharaoh returning to the Delta region would determine that it would be better for Egypt and safer to put these men under lock and key and to enslave them and put them in slave camps. One of the curiosities of the biblical text, which is really fun to speculate about, is that we are told that they multiplied greatly. But the word that is used in this particular sentence is not a word that's used for proliferation of human populations. That was used earlier when it says they moved to Goshen and they multiplied greatly. They're both translated the same way in English, but in this particular passage, the Hebrew word is sharatz, the root word, which is a word used for insects and teeming things. It's quite possible that the author of that particular passage was trying to pass on the idea that they weren't just having lots of children, they were breeding in huge numbers and really alarming the Egyptians. But it's a curious use of a specific word in that particular passage. They were enslaved, and again, many scholars would argue that this was right after the Hyksos, these foreign invaders were expelled from Egypt. There are tomb paintings which show the kinds of activities in which the Israelites were involved. Let's take a look at a couple of these. Here are some men making bricks. As you can see, they're adding water to the clay and the straw. And here they are building walls. And these mud bricks will last for very long periods of time. This is at Tal el Hammam that we've been excavating, but you can see these mud bricks under the ground. These are 5,000 years old, and you can still see the continuity in the shape of the bricks. Now, I'm not going to discuss the details of the various plagues. That's a lecture in itself, but forces were brought to bear by Moses and the Lord to force Pharaoh to release the Israelite slaves. The most terrible of these plagues, of course, was the death of the firstborn of the Egyptians and the Passover of the Israelites by the angel of death. And this Passover is the foundational observance of Judaism, and in fact the Passover was being celebrated by Jesus on the night of his arrest, but it is simply a recognition of God's intervention in their enslavement and the actions that he was taking to release them and return them to their promised land. Let's take a look at the route of the Exodus here. If you look at this is kind of an angled view of the Sinai. They were located in Egypt, in the Delta region, and their ultimate goal was Canaan. The direct route from Egypt to Canaan was the major trade route that went along the Mediterranean, but this was forbidden to the Israelites. They were told don't go there for good reason. There were Egyptian forts all along there to protect the entry into Egypt, and it would have been a simple matter to recapture the Israelites should that decision be made. So according to most traditions, they traveled down along, after crossing some water someplace, the Red Sea, which really is the Yam Suf, they had to cross water in some way to get into the Sinai. There's a lot of debate about where that would be. Eventually traveling into the central portion of the Sinai Peninsula and ending up at a place called Mount Nebo, once again a place of considerable controversy. But at the traditional Mount Nebo, you have St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of the hill, as you see in this picture. And if you wish to go to the top of Mount Sinai, you need to travel up, looking back towards the mountain. You need to travel along this particular trail, which is something that is done by many people every day. And as you get towards the top of that trail, you eventually have to continue up this rock-hewn path, passing through that little gap there and then cutting back and going further on up until you arrive at the top, as you see here, which is a small plateau which can gather hundreds of people, either first thing in the morning to watch the sun rise, they'll have climbed in the dark, or at the end of the day, having climbed up in the daytime so that you can watch the sun set. This is a very moving experience because this is a picture of the sun setting behind Mount Sinai to the west, and if you look towards the east, you can actually see the peak of the shadow as it spreads out over the land. And then if you look towards the west at the moment of sunset, this is the view that you get. A very harsh, unforgiving land that they had to travel in, regardless of the location of Mount Sinai. Now, of course, they stayed there for a couple of years, and the purpose of the stay at Mount Sinai was to get organized, to receive the law, and also to build the Ark of the Covenant. And one of the fun things to do in Israel is that just north of Timnah, near Eilat, there is a group that has built a reproduction of the tabernacle according to the dimensions that are given in the Bible. And if you see it here, you can see some people standing there. The tabernacle was simply a portable temple, and you'd take down all of the posts and roll it up, and then carry it to the next site and relocate it. So it's kind of fun to see. You have a reproduction of the ark there, and then the actual tent of the ark is located there. Now, if we move on, they traveled from Mount Sinai for an extended period of time, eventually ending at Mount Nebo, and we don't know the exact route, but we do know they traveled up the eastern side of the Great Rift. And from the eastern side, if you look at that in a little greater detail, you can see them traveling up alongside the Dead Sea, almost bypassing Moab, passing down through that huge wadi known as Arnon, and then from Dibon they traveled north through the land of the Amorites, being forced to fight them as they went. They were not permitted to engage militarily with the Moabites. And then they ended up at Mount Nebo there, which you can see overlooking the Great Rift at the north end of the Dead Sea, and then from Mount Nebo passed down onto the plains of Moab, which is where they settled. Now, if we look at Mount Nebo from the upside, looking westward, you can see that it's just a little bump on the hill with Israel far off in the distance. And if you look at it a little bit more closely, you can see that there's a church on top of it. And this is the view that Moses had. Moses stood there. He looked out over the Dead Sea. Off in the distance, he was able to see the Promised Land, which is primarily the territory that was given to Judah. And down below, he was able to see the plains of Moab with Jericho off in the distance. We'll pick up the story in our next session. We'll talk about the conquest where the Israelites who were settled down on the plains of Moab entered into the Promised Land, had to fight several battles with Canaanite armies, and then eventually settled themselves in the Holy Land. I hope you'll join us then. Thank you.
Bible Interact is a group of Bible scholars and biblical archaeologists who promote the Hebraic nature of Scripture and view the two Testaments as one unified message. They explain how they use a first-century approach to searching the Scriptures, and they share their methods and discoveries for discussion and dialogue. They invite your comments and participation on BibleInteract.tv, where you can also find more teachings, self-study quizzes, webinars, and interviews.